Lawmakers in Florida are right now working on a plan that would cut taxes for corporations by potentially billions of dollars a year and pay for it in part by kicking tens of thousands, maybe more Floridians off of health insurance and food assistance. They're also passing a bill that would give a gun manufacturer liability protection, a legal shield from lawsuits over a gun that allegedly keeps firing without anybody pulling the trigger. And they're doing it after this gun maker is just raining campaign contributions onto lawmakers in Tallahassee, including giving $50,000 donations to the House Speaker, the Senate President, and the bill sponsor. We're going to tell you about all those bills and many more from week 4 of the Florida Legislature's 2026 legislative session. That's all coming up. Hello and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. Okay, so this is going to be a week in review of the Florida Legislature's 2026 session of week 4. And so in Florida, for those who aren't familiar, we have an annual legislative session that is supposed to be 60 days or 9 weeks. This year could ultimately prove to be a little different. The governor and the legislative leaders are all kind of fighting with each other, and it's not actually clear that they're going to get everything done on time. But generally speaking, we have a 9-week legislative session, and we have just finished week 4 down here, which tells you we are in the thick of it now. We are in the heart of the session where there are, every day there are dozens of bills being heard by multiple committees all meeting at once. The Capitol is packed. Bills are flying through the process. Amendments are surfacing left and right. There is a lot of stuff going on right now. We are in like the busiest part of the legislative session. And so I thought we would take some time to walk through some of the most significant bills moving forward, particularly this past week, with an extra focus on kind of the rent-seeking legislation that is just unfortunately all too common in Tallahassee. Before we dive in, though, just as a reminder, if you are interested in this stuff, please check out our newsletter. The easiest place to find is seekingrentsfl.com. We have lots of stories. We have more quick hit daily podcasts showing up there. You'll find information on all the bills we're about to talk about. Lots more details on them at the newsletter, and you'll find more in-depth stories about some of them too. So I really encourage you to check it out if this is the sort of stuff that interests you. So with that, let's go through the biggest bills from week 4. And I'm going to start with one called Senate Bill 1758. This is a bill that deals with the state's Medicaid program, which is the state's health insurance program for lower-income Floridians, for folks with disabilities, some elderly folks. I mean, ultimately, it covers something like 3 million people in Florida, so it's a major program. But before I get into sort of the details of what this does, for those of you who do follow the newsletter, we had a story a couple of weeks ago about how the Florida Legislature right now, as they start to build their budget, they're considering passing literally billions of dollars worth of new tax breaks for corporations. They're considering anywhere between $1 billion and $3.5 billion worth of new corporate tax breaks, all of which are tied to the federal corporate tax breaks that President Donald Trump and the Republican-controlled Congress passed last year as part of what they called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which included just massive tax cuts for corporations. And some of this relates to how those federal tax cuts then kind of filter down into the state's corporate tax code. And so the legislature is currently considering whether or not to what they call piggyback onto those federal tax breaks, which would result in, as I said, as much as $3.5 billion worth of extra corporate tax breaks at the state level for corporations. And just one quick thing to point out about that, Florida's corporate tax code is so riddled with exclusions and exemptions and loopholes. And I mean like actual loopholes. These are provisions that were never intended to work this way, but now allow companies to avoid taxes just by like faking payments by paying themselves to use their own names and their own logos and their own trademarks. They do all that stuff to dodge state corporate taxes, and it works in Florida because we refuse to close these loopholes. But anyway, our tax code is so riddled with loopholes that only 1% of companies doing business in Florida pay any corporate tax at all. We are talking about like the true multinational giants, your Amazons, your Googles, your Microsofts, your Disneys, your Publixes, and your Florida Power and Lights. These are, when you cut the corporate tax, that's who you're saving money for. So anyway, the legislature is in the process of starting to pull together a budget for the new year where they might include these massive corporate tax cuts. And so they're going to have to pay for that some way. And Senate Bill 1758 is one of the ways they are thinking about paying for it. And so, as I said, this involves Medicaid, and there's a lot in this bill, but specifically the most significant thing is it would impose essentially a bunch of new bureaucracy on people who get their health insurance through Medicaid. In the billionaire-funded right-wing think tanks that push this stuff in states all over the country, they call it work requirements. That's how they brand it, but it's really more like paperwork requirements or work reporting requirements. It is like if you can imagine, God forbid you've ever tried to claim unemployment in Florida, you would know what this process is like. But if you've ever been through some situation where you got to go through a survey that takes an hour to fill out, and you got to go find a bunch of old documents and upload them, and then you finally get to the point you got everything together, you got it all filled out, and you hit submit, and then the fucking website times out. That's the kind of stuff work requirements create. And so the idea here is they're going to require Floridians on Medicaid, many Floridians on Medicaid. The way they say it is they're going to have to either be working, the number is 80 hours a week, or in some kind of training or educational program in order to continue receiving Medicaid. It's one of those things that sounds reasonable on the surface until you actually see how this stuff gets implemented. And what we've seen in other states that have put these kinds of work requirements on either on Medicaid or on other public assistance programs like food assistance, like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or food stamps, is they don't actually get people working. They take people who are working and get them kicked off of benefits because there are all sorts of screw ups in these processes. But it becomes so bewildering and frustrating that some people just end up avoiding the paperwork altogether, or like the government agencies who, remember, their interest here is saving money, they screw up and they mistakenly disqualify a whole bunch of people to benefits to which they are entitled. And that's what these do. And so we have seen example after example in states of people, who have jobs that get kicked off of these programs by work requirements because, again, they are paperwork requirements. This is, the nerdy term for this is administrative burden. That's what they are putting on these programs when they do this sort of thing. The other thing we see in states that have done this is they tend to enrich a handful of vendors that operate these programs, or the mandatory training programs that go along with them, sort of the software systems that they use, and then also these training programs that essentially are temp placement agencies that cycle people in and out of jobs. So these things are bad, and we've got example after example of this in other states. And so in Florida, these work requirements imposed under Senate Bill 1758 would apply to Floridians who are between, I believe it's the ages of 90 and 60 or 64, and even Floridians with kids, if with teenage kids, so kids over 14 and up, you would still be subject to this idea that you have to either be in a job 80 hours a week or be in some sort of training or educational program 80 hours a week in order to continue getting your Medicaid. There are two major issues here. The first is, as we've talked about, what's going to happen is there are going to be a bunch of people who either are already meeting these requirements. Maybe they're in a community college program. Maybe they're in a job skills training program already. They're going to get kicked out anyway because of mistakes, or maybe they qualify for one of the exemptions. So maybe it's a single mom with a 7-year-old, so she shouldn't be exempt from this because if you've got a kid under the age of 14, you should be exempt. She's going to get disqualified from this because either the paperwork and the processing is going to be so cumbersome and spotty that she'll get frustrated out of it, or the state itself will make a mistake and kick her off. We've just seen this story play over and over and over again in other states that do this sort of thing. So that's problem one. But problem two, and the biggest problem here is, and what really makes this diabolical, is that Florida is one of just 10 states in the country that never expanded its Medicaid program under the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And this is so 40 states and the District of Columbia have all expanded eligibility, which allows people of, closer to like the full poverty line can qualify for Medicaid. Florida never did that. So Florida actually is one of the most restrictive states in the country when it comes to Medicaid eligibility. The last time I checked the numbers was about a year ago. Like a single parent with 2 children can't get coverage for themselves unless they make less than about $7,000, $8,000 a year. Like it is a tiny amount of money. You have to be earning, it's something like a quarter of the poverty level or something like that in Florida to get in the door for Medicaid for yourself. So it is already extraordinarily difficult to qualify for this safety net program in Florida. And now you're going to layer on these work requirements where you're supposed to theoretically, this is supposed to get you into a job 80 hours a month, right? And so let's just assume it all worked well. This was all a good faith effort to get people who aren't working, get them working, and that, this isn't really just an exercise in sort of intentional bureaucracy and finding backdoor ways to deny people their health insurance. Let's say this actually found people, you found the stereotypical guy that like a bunch of elitist, moralistic Republican legislators like to invent of somebody just laying on the couch, sucking down their taxpayer-funded health insurance. They find that guy and they get him into a job. Let's say that happens. So Florida's eligibility requirements are so tight. The income threshold is so low that if you put someone into a minimum wage job for 80 hours a month, they are going to make too much money to qualify for Medicaid in Florida. Think about this. Most minimum wage jobs don't have any health insurance. So what you would be doing, if this worked as it's supposed to, is it would take people who have health insurance now and force them into places where they lose their health insurance. It is just a backdoor way there of taking people's health insurance away. It is, as I said, diabolical. Why would they be doing this? Because they're expecting to save potentially hundreds of millions of dollars on Medicaid costs from doing this. One early estimate is that these work requirements would affect something like 110 or 120,000 people on Medicaid recipients right now, and that like at least a quarter of them would end up losing their health insurance entirely. This is entirely just cost cutting. That's all this is. And it is to pay for those giant corporate tax breaks they're talking about. This is the storyline of the 2026 legislative session. This kind of like reverse Robin Hood that we're watching play out, where they're gonna take a bunch of health insurance and food assistance away from low-income Floridians and use some of that savings to offset all these tax cuts for the top 1% of corporations. This is, we are a long way from being done in Florida. They haven't done the session. They haven't put together the budgets, but this is the issue to watch. And Senate Bill 1758, one of the vehicles for that, this passed the Senate Health Policy Committee last week by an 8-3 vote. Okay, so let's move on to another really interesting and I would argue quite gross bill. This is House Bill 1551. And what this is a bill that is being lobbied for by a giant gun manufacturer, Sig Sauer. Sig Sauer makes a very well-known pistol called I believe it's the P320, that has been at the center of just an avalanche of incidents around the country where people, many of whom are police officers, by the way, have been injured when the gun is allegedly firing without anybody ever pulling the trigger. They're calling it ghost firing. So, for instance, there was a sheriff's deputy in Indian River County in Florida, kind of on the midway down the Atlantic coast in Florida, who was shot in the calf when the gun was in his holster, just suddenly fired. And he is now suing Sig Sauer for a products liability case here. And Sig Sauer is facing these kinds of lawsuits all over the country, and they are starting to get really dangerous for this company because juries are starting to return verdicts. So in at least 2 recent cases, I believe there was a case in Georgia, and I believe the other one was in Pennsylvania, juries have returned multi-million-dollar verdicts back against Sig Sauer for these ghost-firing guns. And so one of the central claims that gunshot victims of these alleged ghost-firing cases are making is that Sig Sauer executives knew internally about the risks of ghost firing with these guns, that they had lots of incidents about, lots of evidence and information about the ways in which their pistol was uniquely vulnerable to this phenomenon. And yet, even knowing these elevated risks, they chose not to take steps like adding something like an external safety or like a magazine disconnect mechanism, basically adding an extra safety feature that would that would offset this alleged ghost firing tendency, which not the sort of thing you ever want a gun to have a tendency of, I suggest, or I submit. And so Sig Sauer, this has become a central claim in these cases that Sig Sauer refused, even knowing the risks associated, refused to add these safety features because, adding an external safety would have driven up the production costs of these guns by a few bucks or something like that. And so what House Bill 1551 would do is essentially a legal shield for Sig Sauer. It would prevent you from suing Sig Sauer or any other gun manufacturer in a claim like this if your claim is based on the presence or absence of external safety features like an external safety, like a magazine discount mechanism. Basically, one of these central claims that Sig Sauer is getting found liable under, it would immunize the company against this. So this is House Bill 1551, and what makes this especially ugly is that Sig Sauer has just been soaking the Florida legislature in campaign contributions. It has given, in the few weeks leading up to the start of this year's session, it gave at least $365,000 to key figures in the Florida Capitol. That includes, by the way, $50,000 donations. $50,000 donations each to the Speaker of the State House, a guy by the name of Danny Perez, a Republican from Miami, to the President of the Florida Senate, a guy by the name of Ben Albritton, a Republican from Wauchula, and then to a Republican state representative by the name of Wyman Duggan, a Republican from Jacksonville, who is sponsoring Sig Sauer's bill. So basically, Sig Sauer is asking this lawmaker to pass this lawsuit shield for it, and it gave this lawmaker a $50,000 campaign contribution. It blows the mind that this is legal in this country, that somehow we got to a point where this kind of conduct is actually legal. So that's House Bill 1551. That passed the House Civil Justice and Claims Committee last week by a 13-4 vote. The Senate version of that bill is up for its first hearing next week, by the way. So we're going to have this big showdown. And really, this is an anti-cop bill, right? Like, a number of the victims of these ghost firing cases have been police officers. In fact, we've had a number of police agencies, both across the country and here in Florida, that have started getting rid of Sig Sauer P320s because of concerns over this. So police departments in Tampa and Pasco County and the city of Sanford, which is a suburb of Orlando. A lot of places are getting rid of these guns for these signatures, and yet here you have an ostensibly pro-cop Florida legislature siding with this giant gun manufacturer because, I would submit, this gun manufacturer is giving lawmakers so much money for their campaigns. So that's House Bill 1551. Okay, we're gonna speed the process up a little here. Next bill I want to talk about is House Bill 989. This is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. This is a bill that comes from the car dealers lobby. And so if you've ever wondered why you can't just buy like a Ford directly from Ford or a Honda directly from Honda, it's because we've got a bunch of antiquated laws that date back to the 1950s and 60s that force consumers to buy through middlemen car dealers. They essentially create these state-sanctioned regional monopolies for car dealers. And this drives up the cost of cars. It's why the car buying process is often so horrible for so many people, why you got to deal with these high-pressure salesmen working on commissions. It's because we've got a bunch of old, outdated state laws that keep this system in place and that do nothing but enrich car dealers. I remember once there was a few years back, there was this national study where these economists look at anonymized data, tax return data across the country to find the sort of typical American millionaire. And the vast majority of millionaires in Florida were either car dealers, liquor distributors who have the same sort of enforced middlemen laws that allow them to insert themselves between consumers and liquor producers, and owners of law firms where there's the most of your millionaires in Florida. And it's because of these, essentially the government forces you to pay them money even if you never would choose to. So House Bill 989 is a bill that comes from the car dealers, and it is designed to protect their middleman status, this parasitic situation where you cannot buy a car directly from the company that makes it the same way you can buy a laptop directly from Apple or Dell or whoever you buy your laptops. And so specifically what this bill would do is what they're trying to do is cut off car manufacturers who might find other ways around this. And so this bill is designed to, what it says is like a car manufacturer that starts up like a new line of electric vehicles or something. One way they could potentially try and get around this is they could set up a few new dealers and then just send all of their cars through one or two of these dealers that essentially become de facto the manufacturer's own dealerships. And so this bill would stop that from happening. And basically, it would prevent car manufacturers from steering more than 30% of their vehicles to any one dealer. Of course, it's prospective, right? Like there's a bunch of large dealerships that have car dealers are some of the biggest companies in the country at this point. In fact, you look at a list of the largest private companies in Florida, it's just filled with car dealership groups. But it grandfathers all those guys in. But going forward, it tries to stop. Basically, it's a way to stop car manufacturers from trying to get around these antiquated laws and God forbid, sell a product directly to a consumer and allow a consumer to pay a cheaper price for it, because you don't have to pad the profits for these middlemen who do nothing but sort of suck value out of the economy. So that's House Bill 989. To give you a sense of the influence of car dealers in state capitals, and this is true not just in Florida, state capitals across the country, terrible bill passed by a 16-1 vote through the House Industries and Professional Activities Subcommittee. Another bill that is really important, but also quite politically interesting, Senate Bill 7040. And this deals with an emergency management fund. Like critics call it a slush fund, and I don't think critics are wrong to call it that the legislature set up a few years ago for Governor Ron DeSantis. And basically what it is this giant pot of money that he is able to tap in and use at his sole discretion without reporting any real details to the legislature to respond to emergencies. And this was passed under the guise of we need the governor to be able to more quickly and nimbly respond to hurricanes, which are obviously a huge issue in Florida. And this was a way we're going to give you this fund. And initially, I think they put $500 million in it, and they've just kept loading it up with money since then. And this is you don't have to come to the legislature for permission when a hurricane hits. You've got this giant kitty of money that you can spend as you see fit. The problem is that Ron DeSantis has abused the shit out of it. And specifically the way he's done so is right after this was created, he declared a state of emergency, not for a hurricane, not for a natural disaster, not for a pandemic, but because of immigration, for a political emergency. A state of emergency that he has since extended so many times. Florida is now almost 3 years into this immigration state of emergency, which allows him access to this kitty that has grown to, they've ended up spending something like $6.5 billion out of it, or out of this fund since it's been created. And again, this is money that can be spent without any sort of oversight from the legislature at all. This is how he was able, for instance, to rush up construction of the immigrant detention facility in the middle of the Everglades, the place everybody calls Alligator Alcatraz. This slush fund was how he was able to do it, and how he was able to run it out, award a bunch of contracts to politically plugged-in vendors, again, without any sort of reporting responsibilities to the legislature or oversight there. So there is a provision in the Florida Constitution that if the legislature creates a new trust fund, it sunsets after, I believe it's 4 years. Sunset meaning it automatically expires unless someone steps in to continue it. And so that's what this bill did. This emergency slush fund, Ron DeSantis' emergency slush fund, is about to expire. I think it may even expire next month. And so what Senate Bill 7040 would do would save it. And I believe this particular legislation would continue it on through the end of 2027, and it would allow the legislature to essentially continue funding, both legitimate hurricane expenses, hurricane recovery, response, preparedness expenses, but also these grotesque immigration stunts he's been doing. Everybody remember when he essentially had his people kidnap a bunch of asylum seekers in Texas and send them to, without any warning whatsoever, to Martha's Vineyard. This is the kind of thing you're enabling when you give the governor both this unlimited sort of unsupervised pot of money, and you also do nothing about the fact that he's just kept the state locked in a state of emergency over this political issue for so long. And so what makes this interesting is, this bill has to pass or else the fund expires. And, the governor has been really butting heads with particularly the Florida House of Representatives leadership, who've been really up in arms about wasteful spending by this governor. And this is example 1A or 1B of this, his emergency management spending because of this. And so this is one the governor needs passed, right? He needs it passed. And this is a place where the Speaker of the Florida House of Representatives holds all the cards because a House Speaker or Senate President, they can single-handedly kill a bill. They just never call it up for a vote on their chamber floor, and that kills it. So when it comes to having to pass a bill, that puts a lot of power in the hands of the presiding officers of the legislature. And you sort of saw this as the Senate was considering Senate Bill 7040. The governor's emergency management director was there, and he was like quite sort of like starting from a place of like, we are willing to negotiate on this. We're willing to like talk about like guardrails on this, like limits on like what we can spend it, how long it lasts, how much money we can keep in this fund. You know, they are already coming to the table looking to at least appear to be the reasonable parties here after, you know, again, the governor has just abused the shit out of this. I would argue he's lost. He has shown himself untrustworthy, completely untrustworthy when it comes to being given essentially billions of dollars in access to billions of dollars in unsupervised funds. You know, perhaps you could narrow this down so it is only solely, you know, natural disasters or natural emergencies. Perhaps you could time limit it that it can only be used for emergencies that last 60 days. And if he wants to use it for an emergency that he's going to extend beyond that, then he's got to come from the legislature. Perhaps you could throw in there, he's got to, whatever he spends, he has to timely provide a detailed disclosure of everything he spent out of there. So at least, even if we can't stop what he's doing, we can see exactly what he's doing and throw some sunshine onto this. The point is, there needs to be serious reforms around this if they're going to do it. Senate Bill 7040 does not impose any of those reforms. It just extends the thing. I will say the Republican senators that supported this bill all made some noises, at least about throwing up some guardrails in some fashion this session. So we will see how this goes, but politically interesting. That bill passed the Senate Appropriations Committee by a 12-5 vote. Okay, let's move on to both House Bill 991 and Senate Bill 1334. And these are big new elections bills. These have to do with just imposing even more requirements on people trying to register to vote. These ones are built around like imposing like more documentation requirements on proving your citizenship. You know, the challenge with these laws is kind of similar to the Medicaid work requirements, the paperwork requirements that we'll talk about before, is that it is often that the goal here is not actually to stop non-citizens from voting. It is to stop citizens from voting by just like imposing so much bureaucracy on them. And so like just to give you one little example. So it's going to require like people to dig up more documentation and like do more to prove their citizenship when they register to vote. And like, one thing, it won't allow you to show an expired passport, right? Because it's going to require you to have a current passport, which is just an asinine thing to do because you could have only gotten the passport if you were a citizen to begin with. And there are plenty of people that get a passport because they take like one big life-changing trip and don't ever, you know, renew it or whatever reason, or that have allowed it to expire for like financial reasons or you could have any number of reasons. And so, like, that's just like a little example of the ways in which this is less about genuinely trying to make sure, like, non-citizens are voting, which, again, nobody's ever produced any evidence that this is, like, an actual significant problem. Like, what you do is you find, like, one person out of an election where, like, 10 million people voted, and you use that as an excuse to, like, again, put all this administrative burden on what should be a process that, like, we should want as many people, every legal person participating in this process. We should make voting ideally for everybody, regardless of what party you belong to, regardless of who you support. Voting should be as like painless and smooth as possible, and we have the means to do that in this country. But you know, there's just this push to continually sort of add, like I said, administrative burden to this process, and that's essentially what House Bill 991 and Senate Bill 1334 would do. And I just want to call out one other little provision that speaks to this. And this is only in the House bill right now, but it's just like an especially little like dick move. One thing they're going to do is they're going to like stop letting like university students use their student IDs as a valid form of ID when they show up at the polls to vote. Like, it's just, there's no reason to take that away other than you don't want young people participating in this process. You just want to, again, throw as many little hurdles you can get, because, you know, if you just peel off, you know, a couple of folks out of every 100 or every few thousand, you know, the guys pushing this legislation feel like that's a win for them. So That's House Bill 991, which passed the House Government Operations Subcommittee by an 11-5 vote, and Senate Bill 1334, which passed the Senate Ethics and Elections Committee by a 5-2 vote. I suspect we will see some big elections bill like this pass this year. It seems almost inevitable. And just to sort of throw a bow on this idea of like administrative burdens. This is a bill we have talked about on previous podcasts. Senate Bill 216, which would add even more red tape and bureaucracy to the state's unemployment system. If you are someone who has ever tried to claim unemployment benefits, God forbid you've been laid off in Florida and tried to claim unemployment benefits in this state, this state has made it just as the most painful process imaginable to do it, to the point where I remember I used to work at a newspaper where I had friends and colleagues who were furloughed at one point and sort of were entitled to benefits and just like gave up applying because the process was just so monstrously difficult and cumbersome and time consuming. And because Florida pays some of the cheapest, lowest benefits in the entire nation, we have literally the worst unemployment system in the country from a worker perspective. It is like the hardest to access. And even if you can make it through this gauntlet, the benefits you get paid out are some of the cheapest in the entire country. And all of this, by the way, to save money for businesses, because this fund, the unemployment system, is funded by taxes that businesses pay. So this is a direct, like, we take benefits away from laid off workers so we can lower taxes for businesses. It's one of these direct financial transfers. Anyway, Senate Bill 216 adds even more red tape. This is like requiring people to like giving the state and businesses more ways to get workers disqualified from benefits by claiming they didn't show up for interviews or they didn't have a good enough excuse to show up for a job interview, that kind of stuff. Adding a whole bunch of checks that state officials have to go through, and they have to go through repeatedly as they pay out these benefits, like to someone. It's not just enough that you pass all these checks when you first qualify. Now we're going to have to do it again every couple of weeks. And it's designed to create all these stress points that, again, lead to like mistakes that get people who are eligible kicked off, the same way that all those paperwork requirements for Medicaid are designed to work, the same way, honestly, that so much of these identification requirements and documentation requirements for voting are. It's all the same game, just being applied to different systems. They don't want people getting health insurance. They don't want people voting. They don't want people getting unemployment insurance. And so the way they do it, rather than just be honest about it and come through the front door and just cut this stuff, they try and do it through the back door by just making it, as I said, as painful as possible. That's Senate Bill 216. That passed the Senate Fiscal Policy by an 11-4 vote. This is a bill that's been around for the last couple of years. It originates with this billionaire-funded think tank on the right called the Foundation for Government Accountability. It's been around for a couple of years. Looking like this may actually pass the legislature this year, the way it is moving. So that's a lot of dark stuff. So let's actually talk about a good bill, one that caught me off guard. This is Senate Bill 1498, and it deals with like community associations, homeowners associations, and it was changed last week in a way that was super positive. So Florida has been dealing with this issue the last couple of years, particularly where a handful of big developers, principally it seems like Lennar Inc., the giant home builder, I think he's the nation's number 2 home builder, where they have been essentially locking home buyers into paying these never-ending fees that do nothing but pad the developers' profits. And they have been doing it by essentially concocting these club plan schemes that require people to pay these amenity fees for access to recreational facilities in these developments that never actually get turned over to the homeowners association. They're just perpetually owned by either the developer or a third party, and they bake into these fees a little profit margin for them. And the way they've done it is relies on, without getting too far into the weeds, but basically like this super aggressive, we'll say, reading of the state's homeowner, or a selective reading of the state's HOA laws. It's also, it turns out, illegal. There was a really significant appellate court case in Florida, I believe in 2023. The case, I believe, if you're the kind that likes to read cases, and I would recommend it's often fun to do, called Avatar v. Gundel, I believe was the name of the case, or Gundel v. Avatar, one of the two. But it basically ruled that this scheme was illegal, that the homeowners like Lennar, or developers like Lennar, subdivision builders that were doing this was not legal under the state's existing laws. And so for the last couple of years, Lennar has been lobbying hard in Tallahassee to get legislation passed, essentially overturning that ruling and sort of locking this scheme into place and allowing, sort of enshrining into law this ability to, again, lock home buyers into paying these never-ending fees, these forever fees that include this profit margin. So they're not at all tethered to like the cost of maintaining or operating these recreational facilities. It's pure profit margin for these developers. Lennar has not been able to get that done. That has not gotten across the finish line, in large part because a key legislator has been opposed to it. A state senator by the name of Jennifer Bradley, a Republican from Clay County, or sort of near Jacksonville. Anyway, Senator Jennifer Bradley is sponsoring Senate Bill 1498, and it was amended last week to essentially codify this court case ruling that makes it clear that this scheme, this perpetual profit scheme that home builders like Lennar have been using is illegal. So again, this stuff is super technical, but the changes made in this bill, they go through, like, for instance, just to give you one example, one of the arguments that home builders that use this have made is there's like this provision in HOA law that says, like, assessments, the rules around like homeowner HOA assessments don't apply to like commercial parcels in a development. The idea is, like, if you build a subdivision, you might have an out parcel, like a bank at the edge of the property or something like that. That bank doesn't have to pay assessments to like maintain the golf club or the bocce ball courts or whatever, the tennis courts or whatever. And these homeowners have tried to make the case that well that actually means that applies to anything that the HOA doesn't own. So like when we decide to keep these recreational amenities for ourselves, we are also exempt from all these restrictions on assessments, which include, by the way, not being able to build in a profit margin for yourself. And so one of the many little tweaks that got baked into Senate Bill 1498 is no, that does not apply to recreational areas for which you're charging amenity fees. And so it essentially takes a lot of these arguments that Lennar and other developers have tried to make and shuts them down. It, like I said, it codifies this court ruling from 2023 and would put an end to this practice. So that's Senate Bill 1498, passed the Senate Regulated Industries Committee by a 7-0 vote. This is like, obviously I spent a lot of time here talking about really bad bills for consumers. This is a really good one for homeowners, and one that actually puts a really well-funded lobby on its back foot for once. So this will be an interesting thing to watch here. This legislation in this committee hearing, it seemed clear that it has a big portion of the credit goes to Senator Jim Boyd, a Republican from Bradenton, who's the incoming Senate president. So he's one of the most powerful people in Tallahassee and is supporting this effort to crack down on this perpetual profit scheme. And so this looks like it's got a good shot of passing the Senate. The fight here is going to be with the Florida House of Representatives and making sure they come along. The House last year was a place where Lennar seemed to have a lot of allies when it was trying to pass its bill legalizing these schemes. So that'll be an interesting battle to watch play out in the second half of session. A couple more bills we'll talk about today. So another bill that moved forward last week is House Bill 433. This is one we've written some on the newsletter about too. It is being called the Farm Bill by supporters, the chief supporter being Wilton Simpson, the state's agriculture commissioner. A guy used to be a Senate president, wants to run for governor one day. This is a sweeping omnibus bill. It's got tons of stuff in it. Some of it like good governance stuff, some of it dumb, like preempting local governments, taking away their ability to regulate like gas-powered leaf blowers. Some of it bad, but one poison pill provision really in there. Buried way down in there is this bill that would essentially make it easier for the state's sugar industry to sue critics, to sue like healthy food activists, to sue news organizations, to sue environmental groups for defamation. This would expand something known as Florida's food libel law. The legislature passed a law in 1994 that essentially lowered the bar to win a defamation case for agricultural producers of perishable food items. And this came after the apple industry was the subject of a piece in 60 Minutes that looked at the potential dangers to children of a pesticide that was being sprayed on, or a growth chemical that was being sprayed on apples. And it led to this it helped prompt this nationwide apple scare. There was the apple industry suffered enormous losses related to this. And they initially tried suing for defamation, and that lawsuit failed because, the thing about the United States is the First Amendment exists. So the bar to win a defamation suit under normal laws is very high when you're dealing with either like public figures or public debates, issues of public concern like food safety, like environmental contamination and stuff. And so after the apple industry lost this case, the ag industry as a whole fanned out to state capitals around the country and lobbied for these food libel laws. And Florida was one of 13 states that passed one that essentially for producers of perishable food products specifically, lowers the bar, makes it much easier to win a defamation suit. They get this kind of special treatment in a way that other businesses don't. And so the idea here is to make it much riskier for environmental groups, for activists, for news organizations to run criticism of perishable food products, because the potential financial risk to a defamation suit is much higher because you're not protected by normal defamation laws at this point. The one saving grace about this was that it was limited to criticism of perishable food. And the idea, though, I would submit to you that giving any specific industry its own kind of specialized lower defamation bar to win is a really bad idea, because it gets weaponized to chill public debate and silence criticism. In fact, you might actually know of food libel laws because the Texas beef industry tried to use one to sue Oprah Winfrey after she did a segment on mad cow disease. So anyway, I would argue that like these food libel laws are bad in the first place, but the logic behind them is that companies that are agricultural companies that produce perishable food, like apples, like tomatoes, like anything that spoils, fruits and veggies, they're uniquely vulnerable to misinformation or bad faith attacks because their products spoil quickly. And so bad faith attacks can be weaponized against them in a way that, like, you calling like Disney's roller coasters or Disney's dark rides unsafe doesn't have the same effect, because those roller coasters don't lose value immediately, right? And so there's at least a logic to it. But what House Bill 433 would do, and the Senate version of this is Senate Bill 290, would dramatically expand Florida's food libel law in a way that no other state in the country has, to also include, to make it easier for companies to sue over criticism of non-perishable food like sugar, which is like one of the biggest agricultural industries in the state. But even beyond that, it would also make it create this lower defamation path, easier to win defamation suits for criticism of any agricultural practice. So you could be talking about public health impacts, like, for instance, again, the sugar industry has faced criticism from environmental groups. It's faced really difficult news investigations over the years for its practice of setting these fires in its sugarcane fields, these pre-harvest fires where it burns off the leaves and stuff before it harvests the cane. And these fires drop this toxic soot known as black snow on surrounding communities. I mean, it's actually really gross, because they are barred by law from setting these fires when the wind is blowing east towards the coast, where there's a bunch of wealthy coastal communities and where the soot and smoke would sort of impact them. But when it's blowing in a different direction and all this soot is going to fall on these poor inland areas, they go right ahead. Florida says that's just fine. And so this law would enable the sugar industry specifically to really sort of weaponize the threat of defamation suits, to chill debate and discussion around its products, its practices, its impact on the Everglades, that sort of thing. This has prompted a wild backlash. This meeting of last week, this was in the House Agriculture and Natural Resources budget. This had just an avalanche of opposition from across the ideological spectrum. You had environmentalists, you had fishing guides, you had a whole bunch of MAHA activists, Make America Healthy Great Again. There was a healthy food influencer called the Green Smoothie Girl was there. The Christian Coalition, a group that advocates for book bans in schools. All of them were there to oppose this, because they all recognize what this is an ag gag bill, essentially, that would empower pesticide companies, herbicide companies to come after critics and silence dissent. The hearing was fascinating. There's this opposition, and yet this legislation still passed unanimously. House Bill 43 passed this House committee on a 14-0 vote. This legislation is up again in the Senate next week, Senate Bill 290. So this fight is not over, but this is a really dangerous bill moving through the session. A couple of union busting bills to mention. So House Bill 995 passed the state's State Administration and Budget Subcommittee. This is kind of like a union busting 2.0 bill. So a couple of years ago, the legislature passed this really far-reaching bill that applies to most public sector unions like teachers, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, city clerks, that sort of thing, that essentially required these unions to collect more dues from members, but also made it much harder for members to pay their dues or else lose certification. This one is coming along, and it would pose a whole bunch of new requirements on these these unions. Like one of the main ones is that to form or to keep a union, you would have to win election by a majority of all members covered, not just members voting in the election, which is just an insane idea. There's not a single member of the Florida legislature that would have been elected to office if they had been required to win a majority of all residents of their district, rather than just a majority of the voters voting in their elections. This is nothing but union busting, pure and simple. I think we talked about this last week, but this is the subject of one of the biggest lies of session, where you watch the sponsors and they'll say they'll be all sanctimonious and they'll say something like, this is a pro-worker bill, yet weirdly they exempt police and fire unions from it. None of these new restrictions would apply to police and fire unions, which tend to support Republican candidates in Florida. So if this was pro-worker, why are you hurting cops and firefighters then? It is utter bullshit. They are lying to your face when they say this is a good bill for workers. That's House Bill 995. Also, a couple of different anti-union bills passed: Senate Bill 1236 and House Bill 1387. These are literally like carbon copy bills from the American Legislative Exchange Council. This is a national conservative corporate-funded think tank that sends bills out to state legislatures around the country to get them to all pass these copycat bills, essentially. And what this one would do is essentially force any company taking advantage of getting any kind of tax incentive or grants in Florida, essentially force them to become anti-union employers. It would prohibit them from voluntarily recognizing employee unions when employees collect enough cards. It would even prohibit companies that get these tax incentives from being neutral in union elections. It would force them to actively oppose elections as unions in their workplace. It is, I would be the first guy in line singing the praises of the bill that said we're just not going to do these tax incentives to corporations at all. We're not going to play this game of picking winners and losers, and the corporations with the best lobbyists get these special tax breaks and grants and stuff. But this idea that not only are we are going to do all that kind of the corporate giveaway stuff, but now we're also going to use it to force employers to be even worse to their employees is just it is like a. You tip your cat to just how gross and how anti-worker that kind of thing is, and how anti-free market this is from a place that's allegedly full of free market evangelists. So that's Senate Bill 1236 passed the Senate Commerce and Tourism Committee by a 6-3 vote. House Bill 1387 passed the House Housing, Agriculture, and Tourism Subcommittee by an 11-4 vote. Okay. Couple more to go. Like I said, it's busy time, and the Florida legislature, man, does some wild shit. I'm sorry. Senate Bill 7036. This is a big education package that the Florida Senate introduced last week. And there's one provision in here that I want to flag. It would essentially allow the DeSantis administration, or the next governor as well, so Governor Donalds or Governor Fishback or whoever it is, to become textbook publishers themselves. There's a law on the books that prohibits the Florida Department of Education from entering the business of textbook publishing, right? From instead, this legislation would remove that restriction and allow the state to just go full on propaganda at this point. We already have all sorts of issues with the state forcing textbook publishers to edit and redact their books and take provisions out. God forbid a textbook in Florida make any mention of redlining and the sort of the continuing impacts, the sort of historical and generational impacts of redlining or Jim Crow laws or that sort of thing. Now the state of Florida is like, you know what, we're just going to do the propaganda ourselves. We had a story on Seeking Rents where as they put together the budget, there's a couple of Republican legislators that are trying to get $1.5 million in taxpayer money to pay to a company affiliated with Mike Huckabee, the former Arkansas governor, who's now the Trump ambassador to Israel. They're trying to give him $1.5 million of taxpayer money to develop the curriculum for this kind of propaganda anti-communism law or communism curriculum that Florida schools will soon be required to start teaching to students. Mike Huckabee, it turns out, has this this for-profit education business, or he's part of it, that produces literally these are genuine propaganda guides. It's the Kid's Guide to fake news and media bias, the Kid's Guide to the truth about climate change, all this kind of stuff. They want Mike Huckabee now wants to be the guy writing Florida's anti-communism curriculum. He wants to make a bunch of money from Florida taxpayers to do it. I got to tell you, I think I might rather Mike Huckabee write Florida textbooks than Ron DeSantis. It's not a great choice, I admit, but wow, this is the speed with which Florida is just completely devolving its public education is sort of shocking. Okay, a couple of bills that we have talked about before, so I'll mention them real quick. House Bill 33, this is a tax break for Philip Morris. It would exempt Philip Morris's IQOS heated tobacco product from the state's cigarette and tobacco taxes. It's just literally just a tax break for Philip Morris. It's just an amazing thing that they would even do this for this particular company and given its history in this country. That passed the House Industries and Professional Activities Subcommittee by a 14-2 vote. That's right. A tax break for Philip Morris passed 14-2. So it's got bipartisan support. The only 2 votes against it were Democrats for that, at least. House Bill 2021 passed the House Careers and Workforce Subcommittee by an 11-5 vote. This is a bill that would essentially create a loophole within the state's minimum wage law. This would allow employers to pay less than minimum wage to interns, to apprentices, to any kind of employee that they could categorize as in being in some kind of training or work-based learning role. And the issue with this is actually not, as we've discussed before, the issue with this bill is not what it does on its face, which is bad. Like, generally speaking, we should not allow companies to pay less than minimum wage. It's the minimum wage for a reason. We should not be going backwards on that front. But the issue here is that this bill is like brazenly unconstitutional. So Florida's minimum wage law was put into the state constitution by voters through a citizen-led constitutional amendment, a couple of them actually. And the language of this just completely conflicts with that. There is no argument, there is no reasonable argument you could make to say that this legislation would be constitutional under that under the existing constitution. So this bill seems intended to set up a court showdown where someone is going to sue, and it could even be a bad faith lawsuit arranged, sue over this law once it passes, which would set up a situation where like some extreme right wing or corporate judge could use that case as a ruling to do something truly dramatic, like declare Florida's state minimum wage unconstitutional or something like that. So there is a real risk to this bill, even though when you hear like it allows you to pay less than minimum wage to interns, doesn't sound so bad on the surface, right? But like the situation it sets up, the conflict it is intended to create is really dangerous for workers. And then there was House Bill 399, which would essentially undo, this is a developer-backed bill that would undo protections for rural land that are designed to slow suburban sprawl, particularly in Orlando, where in Orange and Seminole counties that voters have approved what are known as rural boundaries, where any land beyond these boundaries is harder to develop. Miami-Dade County has a similar boundary. House Bill 399 essentially would completely defang those by undoing the teeth that make those that enforce those rural boundaries. So really, really bad bill if you're concerned about suburban sprawl. That passed the House Housing, Agricultural, and Tourism Subcommittee by an 11-4 vote. And the last bill we will talk about this week, this is another one that we mentioned before. The House version is Senate Bill 1632, which is a bill that would empower the governor's administration to designate and immediately sanction what the groups that they identify as domestic terrorist organizations. So this is, given the era we are living in, where right now we have just witnessed masked armed federal agents murder protesters in Minneapolis without any accountability. In fact, complete intentional lack of accountability, claims of absolute immunity from the Vice President of the United States, where we've watched these masked armed federal agents murder protesters and then watched senior people in the administration defend it by trying to smear the victims, the murder victims, as domestic terrorists, even when we can all see the video evidence with our eyes. In that context, the idea that we're going to pass a bill creating this mechanism where the governor of Florida can identify ideological groups he does not like, and label them domestic terrorist organizations and impose a bunch of sanctions without any kind of prejudicial review of this stuff. The way this is set up is someone can challenge it after the fact, but after the designation has already come down. It just seems like just an incredibly irresponsible thing to do this time and age. Maybe there was a time where we could trust authorities to act in. Yeah, I could hear a lot of people laughing even just at that line. But there might have been a time where we could trust people in power to act in good faith and not abuse these kinds of things and actually be about security and this sort of thing. But That is not this time. So this, like I said, we mentioned the House version of this bill. Now the Senate bill is moving to Senate Bill 1632, passed the Senate Judiciary Committee by an 8-3 vote last week. So these bills are now in play, which in legislative parlance means once you get through your first committee hearing, man, you're in it till the end, because now this language, even if these bills stop moving, this language can be amended onto some other bill at some point. So we talk a lot about these last-minute amendments that show up. A lot of times it involves these bills that you thought were stuck and dead get grafted onto another bill at the very last minute. And so that's what makes these first committee hearings really important. And so these domestic terrorist designation bills are now in play for session. So something to keep an eye on until the very end. That's a lot. I appreciate anybody who stayed all the way through this, but that's what your Florida legislature is doing, or what it did in week 4. As always, please don't forget to click like and subscribe, and leave us show review, show ratings are really helpful. That stuff helps spread the word about the show, helps us grow the show. As I mentioned right off the top, if you haven't already, please think about signing up for the newsletter, seekingrentsfl.com. That'll redirect you right to our Substack page, where you can sign up and have all of our stories and podcasts emailed straight to your inbox. Nothing is free. None of the content we produce, none of our stories, none of our podcasts, none of our videos are behind any kind of paywall. It is all free to everyone who wants this kind of information. There is an option at the Substack page to voluntarily pay for a subscription. If you can afford it, if you value this kind of work, please think about doing it. The revenue we raise from voluntary paid subscriptions help us cover the cost of reporting expenses like public records requests, and helps keep all this content free for everyone, for folks that can't afford to pay. Because your state government has such, as I hope you realize from hearing me run through these bills, has just such an enormous impact on your lives, and so many people don't know about it. People know about Congress, they know about the president, and they might know about like their city council or the county commission. They pay no attention to their state legislatures, and that's where some of the most dramatic impacts happen. And so it is so important that we all pay attention to what's happening and hold the elected officials that represent us in state capitals like Tallahassee, hold them accountable. Okay, with that out of the way, we'll be back again next week. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.